Welcome back everyone to the Introduction to Watercolor class. Today we're going to be painting a landscape with pine trees in the foreground and mountains in the middle and background. There are two important points to this lesson. First is the importance of layering. We will be creating successive layers of watercolor from light to dark to create the second important point of the lesson, which is achieving the illusion of depth. We'll be limiting our palette to only two colors, blue and orange. These are complementary colors, or opposites on the color wheel. Using this combination, we can get a surprising amount of color variety. We can achieve an illusion of depth using atmospheric or aerial perspective. To do this, we will mix lighter colors by adding more water for our background imagery, while mixing darker and more vibrant colors for the foreground by adding less water and more pigment. Additionally, we'll use more blue in the background and middle ground and more vibrant orange in the foreground. This is because warm and darker colors appear to be closer to us, and cool, lighter colors seem to recede into the distance. Okay, let's begin by taping our paper down to a board. We'll get our paint palette, water, and sponge set up and create the preliminary sketch. There's no photo reference for this painting. It's based on some things that I've seen, so you can follow along and create a similar image to the one that I'm painting. I decide to start with a mountain in the middle ground. This will be a reference point for everything else in the composition. Now we'll draw a mountain in the background. We want these to be irregular and not too perfect looking. Now let's sketch in our tallest pine tree. I'm placing it on the right third of the paper. We're making a series of irregular wedge shapes that get larger as they go to the bottom. Now let's put a shorter, smaller tree to the right of it. And an even smaller tree to the left. We'll sketch two trees on the left side of the paper. These can be a little smaller and more distant. We don't want this to be too symmetrical, otherwise it'll lose some of the natural quality that we're looking for. At the bottom of the paper, we're going to draw a line or edge for rocks or brush. We'll do this on the left side, and then make a slightly higher edge on the right side. And now we'll just indicate the tops of some distant trees in the middle. Now let's do some painting. We'll start by mixing a puddle of orange with plenty of water to make it lighter and less intense. Let's clean off the brush and mix a puddle of blue. Also with a good amount of water to keep it light. We're using these colors for a wet in wet wash in the sky. So let's pre-wet the top of the paper and bring the water down past the horizon line of the mountains and trees. Now we'll place some irregular dashes and dabs of orange paint toward the bottom of the sky. Now we'll put a few strokes of blue, mostly toward the top of the sky. There's a little area I missed with water that I'll leave for a cloud, but I want to just soften the sharp edge a little. Now let's dry that off with a hairdryer or heat gun. That gives the sky some nice warm and cool variation. Next, we'll mix just a tiny bit more pigment into our orange and blue to make them slightly darker. We'll also mix a warm neutral color by adding a little blue to orange. These will be used for our most distant mountains. We'll start with the neutral color along the horizon of the furthest mountain and paint down into the closest mountain. Now we'll get pure water and soften and blend the bottom edge into the foreground. While this is wet, we're randomly dabbing some of the blue into some points along the top of the mountain to make it look distant and emphasize the edge of it. I'll clean the brush and soften and blend some of that paint that's flowing into the foreground mountain. And we'll dry that off. For the closest mountain in our middle ground, we'll be adding more pigment to these paint mixtures to make them darker and more vibrant. We'll paint our neutral color along the top edge of the mountain and continue to fill in down to the bottom of the paper where we'll add some of the orange. Now we'll dab in some blue right along the top edge of the mountain. This time we're making some small pointed edges in a few places to look like treetops. This mountain is supposed to be closer to us, so it can have a little bit of texture along that edge. Now we'll add in more neutral next to the blue to create some color variation. And we'll dry it off. I'd like to stop here for a moment to explain what we've done to this point. There are two main reasons for continuing to paint our lighter, more distant layers of color right underneath our darker layers. First, it ensures that the next layers, which are supposed to be closer to us, will be darker since they're overlapping those previous washes of color. Second, it helps to eliminate sloppy, uneven, and gapped edges that can happen when we try to perfectly fill in along the edges of areas that are beside each other, like the mountain and the sky, for instance. Now, before we start on the large trees in the foreground, we're going to mix a little more blue into our neutral color and add in a few distant trees at the base of our mountain. These are just little wedge-shaped, irregular dabs of paint. And because we're layering them over the color of the mountain, they're sure to appear slightly darker. There's still plenty of water in the paint at this point. Now we'll get some water and blend this down toward the bottom of the paper. And we'll dry this off. It's time to paint the foreground trees now. We need to mix some dark colors now with much less water. Instead of pure blue, we'll add a little orange into it to make it darker. And we'll mix some orange with much less water. My brush still has a trace of blue that's mixing with it, but that's okay. I'm using two brushes for this. One for blue and the other for orange so that I can paint quickly, keeping those colors wet. Let's start with the dark blue, dabbing in the irregular tree shapes with broken color. I'm trying to be a little erratic with the paint, so the tree shapes look natural and not too perfect. We need to work quickly because the more pigment that's in the mixture, the faster it will dry, and we want to dab the orange in while it's wet. We're just touching a few places with the orange, like the thinner spots where we might see some of the trunk. Now we'll blend it down to the edge of the rocks and brush in a lighter bluish neutral color. We'll start on the tree to the right of this one. I'll make more of that blue with a little bit of orange added to it, and begin dabbing into the shape of the tree. It's okay if some branches go right into the tree we just painted. We'll add some touches of orange and let that bleed into the blue. And now we'll get more of the light neutral blue color, and we'll fill it along the edge of those rocks or ground that we have at the bottom in the foreground. And we'll use it to create another closer row of trees at the base of the mountain. These will be a little darker and larger, and we'll blend and gradate the bottom with some water. Now let's paint a third tree on the other side the same way we painted the other two. We'll start with blue. It can just bleed into the lighter wash that we just put down. Now we'll add the orange in a few spots. And I'll add some lighter blue to the tops of the distant row of trees to make them stand out a bit more. We're not going to dry that. We're going to start right into the trees on the other side now. We'll paint the dark blue on the tallest tree on the left. And add a few dabs of orange. We need to mix more dark blue. And we'll paint in the tree next to it. We'll add a little orange in there. And we'll use the blue to paint down to the edge of the ground and the rocks and add a few treetops on the left. We'll add a dab or two to break the edge of the ground line to make it a bit more uneven. Let's get more of the light neutral blue and dab some in the foreground for variety and texture. We'll soften a couple edges. And we'll add a few more branches on that tree to the left. Okay, let's dry that off. Now we'll mix a dark neutral with blue and orange. We're dabbing this in along the top of the rocky ground to create the look of brush and small trees under those pines. We're not being too careful with this. We want it to look random and natural. That gives a sense of shadowy brush and plants under those trees, and it pulls that forward into space. Now we'll lighten that neutral color with water and dab some of it in the rocks for texture and to soften the edge in a few places. Now we'll dry that off a little. And let's mix a very dark, warm neutral by adding a little blue to orange and very little water. I don't need a big puddle of this. We'll use this to create some hit and miss linear strokes to indicate the trunks of the trees. We're purposely skipping sections, so it looks like branches are overlapping the trunks in different areas. Just 2 or 3 sections in each large tree. And we'll add some to a few of the smaller trees. And I think we're finished. We'll dry it, sign it, and carefully remove the tape. Let's clean our palette, brushes, and materials. And there it is. I think we've achieved a convincing look of depth through layering and aerial perspective. I hope you all enjoyed the lesson and gained valuable experience that will improve your future paintings. If so, please subscribe and click the like button and join me for the next lesson. Have a fantastic day, everybody.